I want to introduce
He's going to roam around.
I would like to introduce you folks to some people that are here today that have played a very special part of my life, and we wouldn't be here without their help. But first of all, I want to start out with Janet Cosgrove right here. There would be no Walt Disney book without Janet.
There probably wouldn't be a Joe without Janet.
Right on.
Now, right next to me, while he's here, right next to me, Margie, come and stand up. These two folks are family. We have been family since 1958. I was on the radio and I was over at KTTV doing a television show with Ben Hunter, and I ran into Jay Hathaway, who was working for a guy doing work, and from that moment until now, we have become family, right?
Right.
Right. I got to tell you something wonderful about Jay Hathaway. Jay Hathaway and his wife are pioneers in natural childbirth. So if you have friends that are going to have children, are pregnant, and you want to, these are the world leaders. They have been traveling literally the world, teaching natural childbirth for how many years, Margie?
1970 is when we started, so
All
more than 40 years.
40 years, and it's called the Bradley Method, and you've had some pretty notable people take your courses, right?
Yeah.
Like, who was one of them? David Hasselhoff, was he one of them?
David Hasselhoff.
Yeah, Hasselhoff.
Hasselhoff.
And others that we know?
Madonna.
Kelly.
Madonna?
Mickey and Minnie Mouse? Now I'm going to tell you a very fascinating story about Jay Hathaway, folks. This is a great time to do it. During Walt's career, and you heard about Walt Disney. Now, Walt was an animator, right? He drew his pictures. They were animated. They were cartoons or animation. When he started to go for live action, he did not have a live action casting director. Guess whose dad he hired to do it?
Yep.
And your dad was the pioneer that Walt brought out. Tell him about how he brought your dad out to do started this out.
He just did. Well, my dad worked for Disney's for about, I guess, 5 or 6 years, and worked on Song of the South. I was in charge of casting and the music, and I don't know. He did a whole lot of things. You mentioned in the book. You mentioned Victory Through Air Power.
Victory Through Air Power. So his dad.
He was the live action person because everybody else had been here longer, but they were all animation people. And my dad came out of this stream of
Yeah, to put it together.
Now,
Yeah.
his dad worked at the Apollo Theater in New York City and knew Cab Calloway. He knew James Bassett, who played Uncle Remus. He also knew Duke Ellington. He knew all these famous black entertainers. By the way, Duke Ellington and I met and became friends years ago. But these amazing, talented people were in the Apollo Theater, and when they were casting Song of the South, whose leading man was black, Walt knew his dad was the perfect guy, because he said to him, "We don't know any black people out here in California." So his dad brought out Jim Bassett. How many have seen Song of the South? Well, it's an amazing film, and you have it here with you, my dear. I have a presentation I want to make to Margie and Jay right now. But Song of the South is one of my favorite movies because Joshua Medar, my mentor at the studio, was the head animator for doing, because it was like 70% live action, 30% animation. Here you go. In there is Song of the South.
Wow.
Tissue paper. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
That's the other one. This is the movie that we did. Here's Song of the South. Look at this right here. Wow. Hold that baby up. Song of the South. It's a classic, and Josh Bennett told me how much fun it was working in that movie. And here's another motion picture.
Tell him who Josh is.
Pardon me?
Tell him who Josh is.
Josh Medar was the guy when Walt was going to do Snow White. He hired Josh, who was a very famous, classically trained painter, because all of Walt's animators at the time were like cartoonists, you know, doing Mickey Mouse cartoons, and Walt had a different idea. He wanted to go from cartoons to caricatures. He wanted to elevate cartoons, which, you know, you've seen cartoons they have today. He wanted to take a new direction. I'm going to talk about it. And Josh Minner was hired, and he was the art director on Snow White. Special effects director for the studio, including here in the park. He was involved in all of the major classic films, Snow White, Pinocchio, Bambi, and he did amazing things on television. He and I worked together on Wonderful World of Color. And I'll tell you more about Josh in a moment. But this was an amazing guy, and he loved working with Song of South. And I'm so glad we got that for you. This is a movie that Jay shot and produced for the Martin Marietta Company when I was in charge of marketing. And it's long been lost, and it was a great film. Martin Marietta bought a company I worked for. We used this film to get into the automotive industry, and I'll tell you more about it, but here's your copy.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Here's my buddy Mark Margolis, who's a lead here in the park. He's a great guy, and if you ever see him, all you gotta do is say, I know Joe, and he'll take good care of you, right? Over here we have Anne Hathaway, Jay's daughter, and the youngest in the family, right? The youngest. Tell them where you work, Annie.
I work at Mousetrap.
Tell them what you do there.
We do digital projections on the castle, and it's a small world, and all sorts of large-scale objects.
Over here we have Mark, who's like a member of. You have fun in our house yesterday? Yes, you did. This is my grandson Zachary and my son Michael, and we're glad they're here. And who else do I want? Oh, I have somebody special here. I want to talk about.
You forgot Mike's family that's here?
Oh, yes. Oh, right in here. Here they are. This is Mike's family. Uncle Robert. This is a family. We're glad you're here. Thanks, Janet. I thought you all said okay.
We tried.
I want to talk to you for a minute about this club. A lot. How many people are here for the very first time? Raise your hand.
Wow, that's great.
Wow.
Welcome. Glad you could make it.
Because of my connection in the studio, people say, how did you get to be with Walt Disney? I was, as Jay knows, I was on radio in LA in the 50s for about 7 years on a station called KPOL. And I pioneered a new kind of format on that station where you play blocks of music without interruption. And our station at the time played music from the movies, from Disney, from the Broadway show, from the stage, and it was upbeat, happy music. And we were at the time were both AM and FM. And when I was on the radio during the 50s, I would get anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 fan mail letters a week. The show I did on Sunday morning was called A Holiday in Stereo, and for 5 years it was the #1 listened to radio program from Santa Barbara to San Diego. It was called A Holiday in Stereo, and it was upbeat, it was inspirational, it was music of Mozart and Bach and oratorios. It was a combination of music from movies and the stage and the church. I called it inspirational. And as Jay knows, when I played music from the churches, it was done with big orchestras. So I had an influence. So Percy Faith, Malavani, and so many others started recording gospel music because of my show. And this show was syndicated around the world by the Far East Broadcasting Company, and it was heard around the world. And one day, I got a call from a man named Ralph Carmichael, who was a very famous conductor and composer of gospel music. Ralph Carmichael, if you Google his name, he's famous. And he called me and he said, Joe, I got to have lunch with you. And I said, okay, I'll have lunch with you. So I sat and had lunch, and he said, you know Glenn Wallach? I said, you mean the president of the Capitol Records? I said, sure. He said, buddy, he sends me his records all the time. I know him. He said, well, he called me, and I had to call him. That's why I have lunch with you. He called me and said, Mr. Carmichael, come meet me in my office. And I thought, okay. And he said, when I met him, he said, Joe, that's what he said. He said, Ralph, I was on my yacht, and every Sunday my wife and I get on my yacht and we go to Catalina and we have Joe's show on because it's got the big surround sound and he opens up all this, Mozart music and then he's playing gospel music and he's playing it all. And I did it all, And because you have to, if you want to get an audience, you got to entertain them. So yeah, we played music from Hit the Deck, There's Gonna Be a Great Day, and stuff that, and when I would play Mario Alonso singing I'll Walk with God, the phone would ring off, and I would get letters with tear stains on it because Mario had such a great voice. So the president of Capitol Records said, Ralph, but we were out listening to Joe, and we heard he introduced your latest gospel music, All the Black Spirits, with a big orchestra, and I went, wow, this is fabulous, and I wanted to meet you. And he said, oh, I'm glad. He says, but more importantly, one of our recording artists called me. That's why I'm calling you. And he said to me, did you listen to Joe yesterday? And I said, yeah. And he said, find out who that guy is. I want him to arrange my next album. And Ralph said to me, are you seated? And I said, yeah. He said, that guy was Nat King Cole. Wow. And I said, oh, Nat, yeah. I met him when I was in high school because his guitarist went to high school with me back in Boston. And he said, is there anybody you don't know? But that first album was Lazy Hazy Days of Summer that would hit the charts, and he said, later, he said, you really changed my life. You never know what you can do for, you know what I'm saying? So I wanted to tell you that the radio was how I got in the studio because they listened to our station, and Josh Meadowar had his art gallery. He was the art director at Snow White, and so forth. I'll tell you more about. He had an art gallery at the Highlands Inn in Carmel, and as it turns out, Jay and I were doing the radio and television commercials for that inn, and I was up there. We were up there frequently, and his art gallery was right there at the fire station next to the Highlands Inn property. And I met him in the dining room. He heard me talking with the owner, and he came up and he said, "Are you Joe Cosgrove?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "I listen to you all the time." I thought, "Oh, really?" And I said, "What's your name?" "Josh Meadow." We began to talk, and after a while, I said, "What do you do?" He said, "I work for Walt." I said, "Oh, you work in the studio." So we became friends. And he said, "I want you to come over and do voiceover work at the studio." So that's, just by being on the air, is how I got connected to the studio, okay? Being on LA radio, I got fan mail from Lucille Ball, from Will Weiler. I mean, I could name you all the movie stars and people that would write me fan letters because they're people. So they go to church or they get in the car and they love it. Most of the people in the show business listen to our station because I did a show every night called Musical Comedy Theater. I would record it at like 3 o'clock in the morning. For about a full year, when I first started, I did a nighttime show from midnight to dawn. And you never realize how many listens you got because that very first night I said, if you have something you'd like to hear, call me. And the engineer said, "You don't do that." I didn't know it. And for the rest of the evening, the phones rang off the hook. I mean, I never did it again. And I realized that we had a 24-hour-day culture and people were listening. But that's how I got hooked up with the studio. Okay. I have somebody else. Now I want to talk about the club. Because of the club, because of my connection with Walt, when the club opened, I was with an aluminum company in Los Angeles working for Harvey Aluminum. And the phone rang, and it was Walt's office saying, "Gal, Walt had passed," but she said, "You're on the list for the opening of the club." So I came here the day it opened, and that was '67, and you came up with me in '67, and Jay can verify the place was over the top, right? It was unbelievable. The buffet was. Jay used to say to me, "Joe, this caviar costs $500 a pound." And your favorite was steak tartare, right? Remember? You like that? They served the buffet here Tuesday, Friday, and Sunday. That was it. When you walked in, it was up there, huge ice carving. And this whole place, the place setting was sterling silver, the Club 33 engraved on it, and crystals had 33 on it. Everything was over the top, unbelievable. And the servers were great, right? They were entertainment, they would come and tell you jokes and they would tell you stories and everything else. So I started, and in the early days, the club, nobody knew it was private. Nobody knew about it. Nobody knew about this club for the first 15 years open. We had our own gate You know what the dog kennel is of that part of the park? We had our own gate and our own parking there, and people thought I worked here because when it came to Club 33 back in those days, you wore a suit and a tie and a jacket. So I would be in the park frequently coming here for lunches, and then a lot of people thought I worked here because, you know, most people come casually, but you did not come to this club unless you were dressed up. The first 15 years, nobody knew about this place. And I met a lot of wonderful people. I met Don Nixon. I met a lot of people that I knew, like Lon Cook from Arco, people that we worked with. But it was an unbelievable experience to be here. Around this whole place was original artwork from the studio, all over. And of course, when Walt passed, and Lily eventually took it. And the trophy room is where a lot of Walt's trophies were put up. There was a lot of Walt in this place, and every time I come in here, I feel Walt. Walt's a special place, isn't it, Shireen? I have another friend here. I want him to come up and join me. And James, come up too. Come on up, sweetie. I have another friend I want you to meet. She is like family, right, Janet? Come up here, Jimmy. Shireen Young and her son, James. This is one of my, like Jay, one of my closest friends in life for a long time.
21 years.
21 years. And this is her handsome son, James Hathaway.
Hathaway? I don't think
I'm
so.
sorry. Yeah. Jim's taking my picture. I'll get you on my mind, Jim. Jim, when do you start college? This fall?
September.
September. Where are you going?
Cal Poly, University, Cal Poly San Luis Obispo.
What a great school. Two of my grandsons graduated, and when she told me, I said, what a fabulous school. My buddy Jack Moline lived up in Laurel Bay. Shireen Young this gal has got more courage. She's like Walt. She's got courage, curiosity, and consistency. Let me tell you about her. She quit a salary job and said, I'm going to go on my own and be a commissioned salesperson. She was working in the aerospace industry. Shireen, I want you to share with this audience how Club 33 launched your career.
Well, I met Joe through another mutual friend, business partner, and I came up here and I thought, wow, this is great. So I started telling my customers, they were like, we want to go. So one day, a guy came from Toronto, Canada, and he said, I want to meet with you. And I said, okay, we had our meeting. And he said, now what do you want to do? And I said, well, you want to go over to Disneyland? He said, sure. I called Joe. Joe, can you get me into the club? Go into the club, we bring a group of people in, we sit down, we have a lovely meal. At the end of it, the man turns to me and says, Shireen, I'm going to give you that order. Well, do you know what the value of that order was? $13 million. So I have been bringing everybody here since.
that same business increased from 13 to what?
178 million.
Can you believe it? This gal, like my wife and like Jay, is a living personification of Walt Disney. This gal and Jay and Janet and James, all these people that I've introduced you to have the same values that Walt had. They're all Christians. They all believe in Jesus Christ. They pray. They read the Bible. I know a lot of people think maybe I'm politically incorrect when I say that, but you know, I'm like Walt. I don't care. But I'm going to share more. But Shireen, I love you. You two things.
Very sweet, thank you.
We'll see you. Thanks. I'm proud of you. I'm proud of you. How can it be what I'm sharing with you? This gal started out with faith and vision like Walt. You imagine you quit your job, and this guy comes and it blows your mind away. Is that not a great story? Is that a great story, John? Is that a great story? What can I say about this guy? I brought my own spotlight. What can I say about him? What can I say about him? What can I say about him? What can I say about Walt? Walt had courage, he had curiosity, he had consistency, and I was thinking about what I was going to say to you today, and I thought to myself, you know what? I got to go upstairs and grab some stuff I wrote a couple of years ago because I'm gonna tell you about Walt Disney. How many of you people know about Benjamin Franklin? How many people know about Benjamin Franklin? Benjamin Franklin was one of the founding fathers of our country, along with John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and George Washington. Ben Franklin is the only founding father that's in the Swimmers Hall of Fame. Where's my little spotlight? I gotta get my thing. Walt Disney was a swimmer. All the founding fathers were equestrians. Walt Disney was an equestrian. Janet's an equestrian. I have a 60mm movie of a company I work for called the Owl Company, and I was telling Janet, I was reeling through them. I said, they were going to throw them away, and I said, no! I was in charge of all the marketing. And I went through the films, and I found a 16mm film shot in 1935 by Dewey Burton, proud of the Owl Company, the company I worked for. He was like Walt, he was a pioneer. He started with one truck in 1919 when he was 19 years old. When the oil boom hit California in the 20s, he went to a truck fleet of 36. He became a multimillionaire, and the rest is history. He founded one of the great companies in America called the Owl Company, so I'll tell you more about him. But in this motion picture, shot in the 30s, in the Depression, the cameraman is on the Rancho ride. I forgot the complete name, but they ride up from Los Angeles, they ride up to Santa Barbara, and it's been going on for years. They still do it. And a lot of businessmen get together, that's when they get away. And in this, as they panning on the 16mm movie around the fireplace, I see Dewey Burton, I see Edgar Bergen, I see Wallace Beery, I see Walt Disney, I see Preston Foster, I see all these famous movie actors, and this is where they socialized. And there was Walt in there, you know, and Walt was a big... Anyway, Walt Disney and Benjamin Franklin were a lot alike. You know, Ben Franklin was the guy, when they were trying to get the Declaration of Independence signed, you know, John Adams was very fierce about it, but Ben Franklin was a person that engaged people. He never confronted people, he kind of engaged them. Ben Franklin, let me tell you, I brought it up because I want to, see if this doesn't sound like Walt. Dreamer, author, newspaper publisher, of course, Walt got in this, inventor, believer, leader, the only founding father in the Hall of Fame, and the only founding father to sign the Declaration of Independence, the Treaty of Alliance, Amity and Commerce, the Treaty of Peace between France and England, and the United States of America, and the U.S. Constitution. Ben Franklin had curiosity. Ben Franklin, Walt Disney had curiosity. Ben Franklin ran away from home when he was 15 and ended up in Philly and then into Europe. Walt lied about his age, but he was that age and got in the army and ended up in Europe. Walt, like Ben Franklin, had endless curiosity. Ben Franklin's the guy that discovered electricity. Nobody knew what it was. And Bill Franklin invented the lightning rod. And people don't understand, because in those days, in colonial America, when lightning hit your building, it would burn to the ground. But once the Ben Franklin lightning rod went up, it was over. Ben Franklin was America's first big media mogul. What about Walt Disney? Huh? Yeah, the similarity is amazing, aren't they? I couldn't help but say Ben Franklin and Walt Disney very much alike, and I wanted to share that with you. I want to make sure I cover all the territory about Walt. So I wrote some notes. I know most of this, but I want to make sure I'm accurate. Let me tell you Walt's secret formula. You ready for this? I didn't put this in the book, but I wanted to share this with you. I learned this firsthand. This is Walt's secret formula for making everything he did. The movies, the television, this theme park. You ready? I went back at my notes and all the stuff I've been saving over the years from the studio, and I put it together this morning. Walt, I wrote these notes this morning. Walt never let the lack of money keep him from dreaming monumental projects. How about that, Shereen? Never let money stop him like Snow White, Fantasia. How many have seen Fantasia? Josh Benner was the special effects, and one day we'll be working on during lunch. He told me how he worked on putting all of that stuff together. And actually, in one of the scenes, he cooked a pot of oatmeal, threw some dirt on it, put it on a soundstage shot, then dressed it up, and you see it. It's bubbling cauldron in one of the scenes. But this is the kind of imagination this guy had. It was just truly amazing. Now, I don't know whether, did you know that Fantasia had 9 musical channels? And Jay can verify this, but I went and saw Fantasia as a kid. You walked into the theater, you got a playbill. And when you walked in, there was the movie. And you sat there, and you were surrounded by the music, right, Jay? Walt Disney created the first musical stereo video in the history of the world. Walt Disney did that back in the late 30s and early 40s. He went around and he had speakers installed in the theaters in the front, on the sides, and in the back. I mean, they didn't call, he called it Fantasound because they didn't talk about, can you imagine? The guy that invented stereo music was Walt Disney. Not only did he do that, when they recorded the soundtrack for Fantasia, they had 9 channels. So that Leopold Stokowski, who was the greatest conductor, he was before Eugene Only, the Philadelphia Symphony Orchestra was the greatest symphony orchestra on the world. And he hooked up with Walt, and they started out, they were going to do one big Mickey cartoon, you remember? The Source of the Predator. But once they get into it, Walt said, well, why don't we do more? Which is how Walt always thought. So they ended up being Fantasia. Fantasia is the most, when it first came out, it didn't make a lot of money, but over the years, of course, it's become a classic, and it's been shown, and it's still being shown. Walt not only, Leopold said he liked it because he could sit with the editors and he could bring up instruments that would be left. You went to a live concert, certain instruments would get lost, so he could bring it up. So when you went and saw Fantasia, you really got the full effect. Can you imagine? It was amazing what this guy did. Let me tell you about, here's what Walt said one day in a meeting. He said, someone said, it was at a brainstorming session. He said, well, you know, making what we do is like having ingredients for when you make a soup. If you want to have a good soup, you have to have good ingredients. So I wrote here's what Walt said about making his films. You have to have a good story, good music. It's got to be done in good taste. It's got to have interest. If this checklist here doesn't resonate, interesting characters, honesty, action, humor, color. And then he went on and he said, you know, guys, we always should cut every scene and not, you know, leave people wanting more. And one thing, Walt, in all the meetings I never heard of it, the word hurry was not, he knew it would take time. And another, also he wanted surprises and a happy ending. But I think the most important thing about everything that Walt Disney did, from TV to movies to theme parks, I think the overwhelming thing was good taste.
Good what?
Good taste for family entertainment. Everything he did was in good taste. Let me tell you how honest Walt was. They were having a meeting on Tomorrowland. And a new guy, a friend of mine from KTLA was there, Charlie Shows, and Charlie told me this story. He'd been in the studio for about 2 months, and Walt called him up. He brought him up because he was doing Beatty, you know, remember the Cecil the CC Sorgan? And Walt kept watching this show. Even Bob Hope told me he loved that show. A lot of people it was on a local station. And Walt said, why don't we have guys like that? So his agent said, hey, Walt Disney wants you to come over. So he got over, he started working. And he's working up, going to do some some television things for Walt. And Walt calls over and says, we're going to have a meeting on Tomorrowland we're doing over at Disneyland. I want you to sit down. I want to see what you think. So they were just thinking about putting Tomorrowland in. Because when the park first opened, Tomorrowland was like, that's coming next. You know, they didn't have it open. So they were having a brainstorm. By the way, Walt Disney, I told you this formula. Walt Disney invented picture boarding. You know what picture boarding is? Storyboarding. Walt invented this. He had guys who were quick draw artists. So when Walt did exactly what I would do. He would paste and he would mimic. He had quick draw artists. So when he was doing Snow White, there was no script that was coming out of Walt's mind, and he would have a whole bunch of quick draw, and he had a room like this, and as Walt would talk, guys would make a sketch and put them up on the wall. So by the time the meeting was over, you had a whole series, because Walt said, if you can see it, we can do it. So that was called storyboarding picture. He invented that, and of course everybody does that today. And rather extraordinary when you think about what he did. So Walt Disney could see it in his mind before it happened. Now let me get back on track. Where am I? I had to tell you about picture boarding. What? Somebody's got it. Walt. It's hard to try to fully explain this amazing man and the impact he had. The first day I was in the studio, and when Josh took me around, he took me to a room called a paint room, and he said, when we were doing Snow White, Walt decided, I don't like store-bought paint. So he sent a bunch of guys over to Arizona to dig pigment out of the ground, and from that point on, Walt made his own paint in the studio. And there's a paint room twice as big as room. This is the first room that he took me in. So when they were making Snow White, they made their own paint. And when you see that, the color on it is amazing. Now understand, Snow White was hand drawn. You all know that. It was everything was drawn by hand. They had to make so many sketches per second because it's 24 frames per second in the film. So if Snow White was going to talk, so each character had a team working for them. So Josh Medar, who was the art director, had 600 animators all working. So Snow White had a team, Dopey had a team, and Josh told me over a period of 2 years, they collected 600 pages of names for Snow White. And guess what? Walt picked them. We've all met a Dopey, we've all met a Happy, we've all met a Dog, and as Janet says, Joe, you're sneezy. And we've all, see, what Walt wanted to do with Snow White was take cartoons and turn them into something that you could get emotionally connected to. So he wanted to elevate the sketches, because Walt was a guy who had a lot of firsts. And one of the firsts was, he was the first guy not only to make his own paint, first guy to do picture boarding, but he's the guy that decided to elevate cartoons into characters in animation. And for the first time in the history of the world, human beings were animated in Snow White. The White, the Witch, the Hag, the Dwarfs, the Huntsman, they were all, and so Walt brought in models, and they would watch them, and they would shoot black and white films, and then they had to call for voices. I can't tell you, I mean, just for Snow White alone, there were 250 people that showed up, and we all know the blog, got it, but Walt had a speaker in his office and a wire down at the sound stage, and he didn't want to see anybody. He would just listen. He would listen to them. You know, we're talking, I mean, how could I tell you except Walt picked out every voice in that movie sitting in his office. So when the gal came in, when he heard this delicate voice, he said, Snow White, don't let her go. And one of the gals that came in was a very classically trained, I've written about her in the book. She was a very Shakespearean actress, and she was 47 years old. And then came in, and she had a very elegant appearance, and she read the Queen's line, and Walt buzzed on the intercom and said, "That's her! Fabulous!" And then while he's talking to the guy on the soundstage, he hears this blood-curdling scream, and then he hears the line from the script from the Hag. Remember when the Queen turns into the Hag? And Walt said the hair went up in the back of my neck, and I said, "Oh my God, who is that?" And the guy says, "Oh, it's the same gal." And she took the false seat down her front. She's doing this. She said, "Great, hire her. We'll get 2 voices for the price." Walt was the first guy to give voices credit on the screen. And Josh would tell me, he said they made recordings of all of these people, and the animators would play them over and over again as they were drawing. And Jay, your dad was over the studio, and he brought home cells from. You got to tell him, Jay Jay and his brother grown up, and Dad's bringing home cells from the Disney studio. What did you guys do with them?
We turned into paper airplanes and we drew on. I wish I had them today.
Okay, I'm going to pause. Anybody got a question or feel like continue rambling on?
No, you need to start signing books.
Okay, what time we got here? Okay, let me go. Let me do a quick run through here, guys. You ready? Let me give a quick run through here. Right here, Rod Miller. Rod Miller was the first and only full-time piano player to come to Disneyland. He started in 1969. Sonny Anderson found him up at a ragtime thing. I have shot, and Jay knows because Jay was there at some. I have shot everything that Rod Miller's ever done on high definition television. And later, I talked to my daughter Marla yesterday, and she said, "Dad, you've got so much great stuff from your career with Jay and so forth. We should go online and make a YouTube network for you." So we're later this year going to launch a YouTube network. I have got everything Rod has ever performed. Who was at my house yesterday? You were. You watched Rod Miller. What do you think? Tell the audience how you thought about it. This gal is a music director for bands in the school. Here she is right here. Tell them what you thought about Rod Miller when you saw him.
Some of the most amazing technique I've ever seen.
Rod Miller can play not only double time, but triple time. And you know what? Rod Miller is self-taught. He got an old player piano with the rolls, and he taught himself how to play. And when he was here on Main Street at Coke Corner, he was always surrounded, right, Jay? And I'm going to put him up. I recorded him for 10. I'm going to put him up online in the future. Rod Miller, amazing guy. What can I say about Billy Graham? Billy Graham, I went to Wheaton College with his sister. Billy Graham, I met Billy Graham in 1949 in my church when he came from Los Angeles. Billy Graham is, if every preacher was like Billy Graham, there'd never be a scandal. Billy Graham is he was like Walt. He lived what he believed. Okay? Over here we have Jack Lindquist. Jack was the first president of Disneyland. Jack started out here selling advertising to Walt, and then finally Walt said, "Why don't you come be my advertising manager?" He was Disneyland's first president. He's the guy that invented Disney money and brought on the Mickey Mouse Club. Just an incredible guy. What can I say about Ricardo Montalban? Now, that picture right there was taken by the man behind the camera right in front of me, James Hathaway. Jay and I spent a day with Ricardo Montalban doing a promotional commercial for Los Angeles television. What a gentleman, Ricardo. What can I tell you about Ricardo Montalban? Was a famous movie actor, but a lot of people don't know. They know him from Fantasy Island and his movie films with Esther Williams, where he was swimming with Esther. But Ricardo Montalban was like Walt. He was a church-going, God-fearing man, just a great guy, right, Jay? We spent a wonderful time with him. Now, coming down over here, Paul Newman. How many people know Paul Newman? About Paul Newman. Paul Newman was not only a famous actor, but Paul had a great passion for racing. And when I was with Harvey Aluminum, I was in charge of racing our cars at Indianapolis 500. Mario Andretti was our 1 year when we won the race. But Paul and I became connected when he was shooting a motion picture, and they wanted to shoot it at the shop where we made our Indianapolis cars. So I met Paul there. And Paul was a great humanitarian. He did a lot of great things for kids. Down right below Billy Graham, we have another man right here, clapping his hands, named Charles E. Fuller. Now, when Walt was beginning his movie studio, Charles E. Fuller, who was a business, he had gone to Pomona College, he graduated cum laude, he was one of the founders of the Sunkist. Now, you've all heard of the Sunkist Growers, the Sunkist Cooperative. He was the founder of that, and he was the first director, and he was a very successful businessman with a home in Palm Springs and one in Arrowhead and one in Newport Beach and Iran. I mean, that's not too bad back in the teens. Charles Fuller went to a church one Sunday, and he heard a message. What's it a profit a man if he gains the whole world? And Charles Fuller went to seminary. And when Walt was starting the movie studio, Charles Fuller was pioneering on a brand new technology called radio. Charles Fuller was the first radio inspirational person. He started right here on Orange County on one station owned by the Orange County Register, KREG, and by the time World War II came, Charles Fuller had gone to 2,000 stations and was heard around the world and became the electronic chaplain. Charles Fuller, like Walt, plus elevated. Thurl Ravenscroft. How many have heard of Thurl Ravenscroft? His voice is all over Disneyland. He and Paul Reed. Thurl Ravenscroft is at the railway. He's everywhere. Thurl Ravenscroft said the thrill of my life was singing in the quartet for Charles E. Fuller. Charles E. Fuller, as you were at my house, you heard it. He had the best quartet. He had the best piano. Why? Because he was like Walt. He wanted to have it. He did his problem. Bob Hope was a good friend. We'll get to Bob in a minute. Bob Hope was a good friend of mine. When Bob and Jack Benny were doing their radio shows in Hollywood, in studios in the 40s, in front of 300 people, Charles Fuller had moved his program, his choir, his quartet, his whole musical, to the Long Beach Municipal Auditorium, which had just been built because he wanted to be there because the war was coming and he wanted to be down there when the servicemen were going to the Pacific. Charles Fuller went down to this auditorium that seated 5,000 to 8,000 people. And every week, 5,000 to 8,000 people would come to the Long Beach Municipal Auditorium to hear Charles E. Fuller. He had a program. When he was on the air in America, he had the highest rated program on Sunday above every other program. He was syndicated. He was Charles Fuller was the syndicated pioneer. He's the first one to take transcriptions and start his own network. That's why he went around the world. There's a book coming out later this year called By Radio Every Sunday, written by a history professor at Indiana University. And here's what he said about Charles Fuller. If every media preacher, if every media person on television were like Charles Fuller, there would never be a scandal. Because Charles Fuller did it right. He was on radio for 40 years and he never asked for money. Never asked for money. And we're talking about a broadcast which cost millions of dollars to be on the air because it was on major networks. It was on Mutual, it was on ABC. And you know why he succeeded? Because it was class. I talked to Harvard scholars who wrote a book about radio during the Depression, and she said Charles Fuller was a standout guy. He did it right. Today, there's Fuller Seminary in Pasadena where I went and met him, and I wasn't disappointed. And his enduring legacy is that seminary that he started in 1947 has become the greatest seminary in the history of the world.
You're on time, buddy.
Okay. We have Bill Cosby. We have Steve Allen. We have Ronald Reagan. You have to read my book to read about those guys. Thanks very much.
Now, Joe's going to go out here and start signing books. He can also have a picture taken with him. Thank you so much for coming. Book signed. Have at it.